Association policy. This was a system of French colonial administration that prevailed in the colonies after the failure of the assimilation policy. Unlike assimilation, the association policy respected the culture of Africans and allowed them to develop independently, and it did not force them to adopt French culture. The association policy was practiced in Africa after the failure of the assimilation policy. It insisted on the relationship between the Africans and the French being that of association and not otherwise. The association had to use the indigenous elites who were trained in France as administrators to mediate between fellow Africans and the French colonial administrators. The major purpose of the association policy was to create mutual economic development for both the Africans and the French. However, the implementation of the association policy was impractical, since the Africans had their traditional institutions such as customs and traditions. African rulers were used by the colonial administration to fulfill their demands such as collection of taxes, labor recruitments, and maintaining peace and order in their areas. African chiefs who failed to perform such duties were replaced. African traditional rulers were not given any authority to execute anything through their own initiatives without the consent of the French colonial administrators. Unlike the British colonies, the French association policy limited the Africans in their colonies of the right of free speech, trade union activities and freedom of the press. This policy of administration wanted the French colonial government to respect the culture of the people in the colonies, and allow them to develop independently instead of forcing them to adapt the French culture. Moreover, the association policy of the French treated the other Africans as second-class citizens. They were not had to follow the French civil and criminal laws, but the assimilees remained as French citizens with all rights. However, the non-citizen subjects could suffer arbitrary arrest or serve a term in the French army than the citizen, a thing that motivated them to be French citizens. The new French policy of association encouraged the French colonial administrators to respect the African cultures and give them freedom of developing separately. However, this policy made Africans in the colonies to be regarded as citizens, and French criminal and civil laws could not be applied to them. The Africans were governed by a system of law known justice indigene. This law made the Africans to serve the army for a long time by force or face arbitrary arrest. As a result, Africans opted into becoming French citizens. Africans had the right of maintaining their culture. Examples of such cultural practices were polygamy and Islamic religion in West Africa. Strengths of the association policy. The following were some of the strengths of the association policy. 1. It did not interfere with African cultural practices such as religion, customs and traditions. 2. The association policy considered the assimilated Africans as French citizens. 3. It did not apply French civil and criminal law to Africans in the colonies. Weaknesses of the association policy. The following were some of the weaknesses of the association policy. 1. The association policy was more authoritarian and withheld African rights to freedom of expression, trade union activities and the press freedom. 2. It forced Africans who were not assimilated to serve the French colonial army for longer periods than the assimilated ones. 3. It regarded the non-assimilated Africans as second-class citizens. The similarities between the assimilation and the association policies. The following were some of the similarities between the assimilation and the association policies. 1. Both were metropolitan administrative systems introduced in French colonies. 2. Both systems of administration aimed at plundering the natural resources of Africans. The differences between the assimilation and the association policies. Some of the differences between the assimilation and the association policies were: 1. The association policy was a colonial administrative system in which France had to respect the culture of her colonial people. Assimilation policy, on the other hand, was the system of administration used by the French in which the Africans were taught how to think and act as French citizens, aiming at colonizing Africans by transforming them into French citizens. 2. The assimilation policy was economically expensive compared to the association system, which did not demand more French funds. 3. In the association policy, colonies were regarded as other colonies in Africa and thus they were not close to the colonial master, while in the assimilation policy the colonies were regarded as their overseas provinces. Thus, the colonies were closely attached to the colonial master. The association policy made Africans to be regarded as second-class citizens, while in the assimilation policy Africans enjoyed the privileges and rights that governed any French citizen in the metropolis. The similarities between the association policy and direct rule. The following were some of the similarities between the association policy and direct rule. 1. Both were metropolitan administrative systems with one major interest of exploiting African resources and labor force. 2. The two systems were characterized by the use of force and racial superiority. For instance, Germans who practiced direct rule felt superior to other races. 3. In both systems, an authoritarian approach was used. For example, African press, trade union and political activities were suppressed by colonial governments. 4. In both systems, the colonial imperialists took control of their colonies for a long time. For example, the white settlers in Zimbabwe under direct rule and the French colonies in West Africa. 5. Both colonial administrative systems aimed at plundering the natural resources of Africa. The differences between the association policy and direct rule. Some of the differences between the association policy and direct rule were: 1. The association policy did not experience great enmity as it respected African culture, while direct rule experienced great enmity from Africans due to their harsh and brutal rule. 2. The association system had less cost of administration unlike direct rule, which required many Europeans to perform administrative tasks which led to higher costs of administration. 3. The association system of administration was used by the French government after the failure of assimilation, while direct rule was used by German colonial powers and the British in areas where they thought indirect system could not work. 4. In direct rule the European settlers' population was big in the colonies, while in association policy Africans were also allowed to live in the colonial master's country. The similarities between the association policy and indirect rule. The following were the similarities between the association policy and indirect rule. 1. Both were colonial administrative systems used in African colonies. 2. Both systems used African intermediaries in their administration and preserved traditional methods of choosing leaders. 3. In both policies, the whites occupied higher administrative posts, while the Africans occupied lower positions in the administration. All offices from district officers, commissioners and the governor were occupied by the British and the French. 4. Both systems used crude ways of ruling, exploitation, taxation and forced labor. 5. Both systems were introduced after observing the shortcomings of the other systems used previously. For example, association was introduced after observing the weaknesses of the assimilation policy, while indirect rule was introduced after observing the shortcomings of direct rule. The differences between the association policy and indirect rule. Some of the differences between the association policy and indirect rule were: 1. The association policy encouraged the French colonial administrators to respect the African culture, while the indirect rule system of administration disregarded the African traditional culture but only used traditional chiefs for their interests. 2. The French emphasized on the use of the French language in her colonies, while the British on the other hand considered and allowed the use of local native languages together with English. 3. The French association policy still maintained the aim of transforming Africans into Frenchmen by making the laws whereby non-citizens faced arbitrary arrest, serving the army for a long time, while the British made no attempt to transform the Africans.